Virtua Racing!
First released in 1992, Virtua Racing ushered in a new era for Sega, trading superscalar technology and pseudo-3D for full-on polygonal graphics. And now, thanks to the wizards at M2, Virtua Racing returns on Nintendo Switch. Sega Age's Virtua Racing strives to replicate AM2's original masterpiece while introducing support for higher resolutions, higher frame rates, and local split-screen play for up to 8 players. But this is only the latest in a long line of Virtua Racing home conversions. From Mega Drive, 32X, and beyond, Virtua Racing has been released and re-released many times over the years. But not once has it truly managed to perfectly capture the arcade experience. On this episode then, we're revisiting every official console release of Virtua Racing. Has M2 finally captured the original arcade experience on Switch? And just how close did each prior version come to matching the original? All that and more is coming up on this high-speed episode of DF Retro. The racing game. Since the earliest days of video games as a medium, man has dreamt of hitting the virtual tarmac while sitting behind the wheel of their car of dreams. While crude, early games did manage to deliver this spirit of driving, but things would accelerate quickly. During the heyday of the arcade, companies such as Namco and Sega moved into the pseudo-3D space, releasing new, more advanced games at a regular interval. Classics such as Pole Position from Namco and 1986's seminal Outrun really set a new standard for what a driving game could be. With the camera placed firmly behind the car, it was now possible to deliver a more realistic three-dimensional experience, even if the games ultimately relied on 2D sprites. But by the end of the decade, companies were beginning to experiment with polygonal graphics. This experimental time resulted in some expensive and exotic machines that produced convincingly 3D visuals at a relatively low frame rate, but even still, it was a magical time. Rather than embracing 3D at the start, however, Sega continued to push new ground with its superscalar games, at least until 1992. Virtua Racing arrived in August 92 and single-handedly ushered in a new era for Sega and real-time 3D graphics. It wasn't the first polygonal racing game, mind you, but it offered key improvements that made for something far more impressive than anything released prior. Virtua Racing was the first game created for Sega's new CG board, later christened Model 1 when the development of the next generation Model 2 board began. Sega developed Model 1 internally starting in 1990, aiming to best Namco's System 21 board, which powered various polygonal games, including titles such as Winning Run. Virtua Racing itself started off as an experiment designed to test the hardware's capabilities, but the idea was simply too good to sit on, and it was ultimately developed into a full game. Through a modern lens, it may not seem like much, but for 1992, it was a true revelation. So what is it that made Virtua Racing so special back at that time? Simply put, it was the smoothest, most detailed polygonal game anyone had laid eyes on. It looked and moved unlike anything else on the market. Part of this stems from performance. The expensive CG board could display the fully 3D environments of Virtua Racing at 30 frames per second, double that of Namco's earlier Winning Run. While this would be superseded rather quickly with the even more impressive Daytona USA in 1993, it was an important step in delivering fluid gameplay in a 3D world. Secondly, while Virtua Racing relies entirely on flat-shaded polygons, the number of polygons used to build its world and vehicles was a clear step up from any other 3D game at the time. Then there's the cabinet itself. In its deluxe format, Virtua Racing is, as far as I can determine anyways, the first arcade game designed with a 16:9 widescreen monitor. Monitors and televisions of this era were almost universally 4:3 in aspect ratio, but this widescreen display opened the field of view, leading to a more immersive experience. All of this was backed by the expected AM2 gameplay with tight handling and excellent track design. It was a true milestone for 3D racing games. And it never truly received the home conversion it deserved until now. It's for this reason that the Nintendo Switch version of Virtua Racing is so welcome. Developer M2 set out to build a version of Virtua Racing that recreates the original arcade experience while offering key enhancements. We'll compare and contrast with prior conversions of the game shortly, but first let's focus on M2's remarkable work on the Switch version. The team behind this project has long wanted to tackle Virtua Racing. It was initially in development for 3DS in fact as part of the Sega 3D Archive series, but was decided that, due to budget and time constraints, it was not to be. Shortly thereafter, however, the project was revived for Nintendo Switch, and M2 has focused on delivering what I might call Arcade Plus, a version of Virtua Racing that replicates yet enhances the original arcade game. The process was seemingly difficult, but thanks to the retrieval of the original source code by Rieko Kodama, the team was able to accurately simulate the game. The first key enhancement then is resolution. The arcade original runs at 496 by 384, which was quite a high resolution for 1992, but the Switch version makes the jump to a full 1080p in docked mode and native 720p in portable. Due to the flat shaded nature of the game, it upscales beautifully to higher resolutions. M2 has opted to avoid using any form of anti-aliasing as well, instead allowing pixels to run free, producing a very sharp image in the process. Like the original, transparency is handled using a mesh pattern, but when viewed at higher resolutions, the effect is surprisingly convincing. It all feels very faithful from a visual perspective, with one exception. Side-by-side comparisons reveal an annoying flaw in the conversion: color reproduction. The darker hues of the original game appear somewhat lighter on Switch, with the red car taking on a pinkish hue and greens appearing overly intense. It's not entirely clear why this is the case though, as it doesn't seem like something M2 would have fumbled, so perhaps it's intentional? It could also be the result of a color conversion error, who knows? Either way, thanks to the flat shaded design of the game, the change in color still produces a pleasing image. It should be noted, however, if you change the color of your car to something like black and then back to red using the Grand Prix mode, the red will display properly, but it doesn't solve the issue with the other colors in the game. One thing to keep in mind though is that Model 1 draws its polygons in a different manner. Like other Sega 3D hardware that would follow in its footsteps, Model 1 draws using quads as primitives rather than triangles like hardware of today. Polygons are also sorted differently. Rather than using a Z buffer, the sorting method here is less precise, resulting in visible intersection errors. That is kind of part of the charm of Model 1 visuals. M2 has managed to perfectly replicate this on Switch, which I feel is key to capturing the aesthetic. Perhaps the most impressive upgrade though lies in how the map itself is drawn. The original clips polygons at a certain distance from the camera to reduce overall strain on the hardware. But on Switch, the entire track is always drawn. You can see far into the distance during every race. There is zero pop-in. This does reveal some limitations in the original modeling, of course, but the effect is remarkably impressive and welcome. At the same time, all bitmapped 2D elements are pulled directly from the arcade as well and scaled using Nearest Neighbor, at least in single-player mode. The clouds and text are razor sharp and perfectly match the original game. Another key change then is the bump in frame rate. According to M2, this was one of the most challenging aspects of the project. Virtua Racing was coded to run at 30 frames per second after all, and dramatic changes were required to increase the frame rate without breaking the game logic. Background objects still update at a lower rate, mind you, but the overall performance level is increased, resulting in a more fluid experience all around. And whether you're in docked or handheld mode, the game holds a locked 60 frames per second at all times, at least in single player and two-player split screen mode. Of course, this also brings us to one of its most interesting features: large-scale split-screen play. Like the original arcade version, which could support 8 units linked together, the Switch version allows 8 people to play on a single machine. The frame rate is dropped to 30 frames per second if you go with 3 players or more, but the results are still remarkable. M2 uses 2 CPU cores in this mode, with each core emulating the equivalent of 4 Model 1 boards. This mode requires players to use the Joy-Con in horizontal mode, however, and during testing we found that Joy-Con dropout was kind of a problem, so it's something to consider. But still, when it works, it's an amazing addition and unlike anything we've seen to date. If you have a large enough television, the size of each window is surprisingly reasonable as well. Content-wise, the Switch version features only the tracks and vehicle from the arcade game. The team did investigate the possibility of including the extra tracks from the 32X version, but the collision and track data is not compatible with the arcade game. It would require a complete from-the-ground-up recreation, which was beyond the scope of this project. Another important detail then is the audio. The original sound has been fully replicated here and it sounds tremendous. But in typical M2 fashion, the team has gone above and beyond in certain cases. The new replay mode, for instance, features a song from the 32X version of Virtua Racing, which sounds like this in its original form. It's good stuff, but the instrumentation is very different from the arcade game. The solution? Recreate the song to match the specification of the original arcade hardware so that it matches the other music tracks featured in the game, and the results are fairly impressive. It's this attention to detail that defines an M2 conversion then, and it's just one of the reasons I feel that this version of Virtua Racing is now the definitive version. It's packed with features, the handling is better than any other home version before it, and it just looks fantastic in motion, plus that 60 FPS frame rate is much appreciated. Even with the color shift, this is the best version of Virtua Racing ever released. But it's taken many years to reach this point. Following the original arcade game then, Virtua Racing was ported to many platforms, and today we're going to take a tour of every home version of the game. So buckle up because here we go. The very first home conversion of Virtua Racing was created and released for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis depending on your region. It's a feat that seemed impossible on the surface, but the results are remarkable. This was achieved by embedding an additional 16-bit custom DSP chip based in the Samsung SSP160X. This chip contains an arithmetic logic unit while running at 23 MHz and supporting supposedly upwards of 9,000 polygons per second, a far cry from the 180,000 polygons per second of the Model 1 board. While the chip is limited by the VDP of the Mega Drive in terms of color, the development team was able to create a surprisingly faithful conversion that features all 3 tracks remodeled for the system. The polygon count is of course hugely reduced, surfaces appear highly dithered, and the frame rate is capped at just 15 frames per second, but it works. The Mega Drive likely handles things like input, camera position, and the like, while the SVP chip is used to generate the polygon graphics, which are passed back into VRAM. Collision detection is of course paired back from the original version with things like trees and signs lacking any sort of collision data at all. Still, it runs faster than any Super FX 3D title on the Super NES and stands as a monumental achievement for the Mega Drive. The only downside here is that thanks to the cost of the additional chip, Virtua Racing retailed for $100 at launch. But it wasn't the only version of Virtua Racing released in 1994. While the Mega Drive version launched in early '94, the other version, Virtua Racing Deluxe, appeared on Sega's new 32X system later in the year. Virtua Racing Deluxe is one of my favorite conversions of the arcade game. Featuring 2 new tracks and additional vehicles, it's a fully featured package and one of the best games on the 32X. It also offers a noticeable increase in quality over the original Mega Drive release. Car and world detail is boosted, while the color palette is increased to take advantage of the 32X hardware. It's a much cleaner, smoother looking game overall, even if it still falls short of the arcade game by a wide margin. Like the Mega Drive version, collision detection is pared back compared to the arcade and Switch versions, and things like the pit crew disappear immediately at the start of the race. The frame rate, on the other hand, is bumped up from 15 to 20 frames per second in this version, making for a more playable game, while audio quality also takes advantage of the 32X's hardware. For years, this was the best version of Virtua Racing you could enjoy at home, and while it's a bit sluggish today, I still think it holds up remarkably well. Which is more than can be said for the Sega Saturn version, which followed in its wake. Developed by Time Warner Interactive, the Sega Saturn version of Virtua Racing is kind of a mess. At first glance, it seems to have potential, with a lot of tracks and plenty of modes to choose from, but once you get in the game, it becomes clear that something isn't quite right. The first issue is one of performance. The frame rate is highly erratic, lending the game a sense of jerkiness that makes it less pleasant to play overall. Sure, it can outperform the 32X release at its best, but it's so much less consistent that it just doesn't feel as nice to play. Controls, FOV, and car models have all been changed as well, and it just feels less fluid overall compared to the 32X version. I'm also not a fan of the new 2D background artwork, which takes on a more realistic rendered appearance versus the beautiful blue skies of the original game. That said, there are a few nice options here and there. There are more modes available and plenty of new tracks, which is kinda nice. Not to mention new cars. So it's still a decent little racing game, but Time Warner failed to nail the controls and performance, which ultimately hurts the experience. It's an inferior game to the 32X release overall. And it was also the last home version of Virtua Racing released during the 90s. The next decade would see two more releases of Virtua Racing, one on PlayStation 2 and another on mobile phones? Okay, so I don't have access to the phone version, mind you, but YouTube user KTW Kubota uploaded footage nearly a decade ago. Apparently, it runs on a variant of the Sharp Aquos Keitai line of mobile devices, and from what I can tell, the results are rather impressive for the time. Remember, this is a phone which predates the iPhone. I wish I could get my hands on this just to better understand it, but for now, well, there it is. If you want to see the full video, be sure to check out his channel. Before this, however, a PlayStation 2 conversion of Virtua Racing known as Flat Out was released as part of the Sega 3D Ages collection, and it's pretty darn good. This version of the game takes a decidedly different approach. It retains the flat-shaded polygonal look, but introduces several significant enhancements, lending it a unique appearance. Reflections, for instance, are now present on the player car, with scenery visible across the surface of the paint as you drive across the track. Shadows, perhaps of the stencil variety, are cast from scenery within the world. So as you drive across a bridge or next to a shallow embankment, shadows will be drawn across your car in a realistic fashion. This element retains the stark design language of the original game, however, so it never really looks out of place. Draw distance is also boosted from the arcade original, and geometry appears to have been enhanced, not to mention the improved effects work. Just look at this. Beyond that, this is the first version of Virtua Racing to run at 60 frames per second. Now, it uses field rendering, which means the image basically alternates between odd and even scan lines every 16 milliseconds, so if you're watching this video on YouTube, it will only appear correctly when using the 60 frames per second option. One thing is clear though, unlike the Switch release, I'd wager that this version was coded from the ground up for PlayStation 2 rather than utilizing any code from the Model 1 original, which is perhaps where some of its drawbacks become evident. The handling and the feel of the game just isn't quite right. Now it works well enough, but it's so different from the original it almost feels as if your car is swiveling on some imaginary fulcrum. On the other hand, one benefit of this approach is the improved simulation of secondary objects. Things like signs, for instance, update at a full 60 FPS when you crash through them, just like the rest of the game, which is not true of the Switch port. Another great feature is the introduction of time of day changes. You can choose to race during the day or at dusk, lending familiar tracks a unique new sensation. It's a nice touch. But what if the resolution is just a little too low for you? Well, thankfully, PS2 emulation is in a great spot, and PCSX2 runs Virtua Racing very well. It's now possible to crank up the resolution well beyond the original game and achieve a super sharp and clean image in the process. It looks and plays great via emulation and is an excellent solution for playing this version of the game. And honestly, despite the handling issues, this version is fantastic with its own unique tracks, beautiful visuals, and different, though still a lot of fun, arcade handling. Next to the arcade and Switch versions, this is probably my third favorite iteration of Virtua Racing. And until the Switch release, these were the final iterations of Virtua Racing. Now that we've seen every version though, you might be wondering, what is the easiest and best way to play the game today? Well, I suppose the obvious answer then is the Switch version. It's currently only available on the Japanese eShop, but it's simple enough to create a Japanese account on your Switch and make purchases from this shop. Once complete, you'll be able to enjoy the game right now. As this is my favorite version of the game, it's the one I recommend first and foremost. Now, while it hasn't been announced, it's likely that a Western release is on the horizon at some point, so hopefully the wait won't be long for this one, if you don't want to create a Japanese eShop account. Next to this version though, there's always the emulation route. MAME handles the Model 1 version rather well, but it's obviously not quite the same as a real arcade machine. Still, it's definitely one way to go. The PlayStation 2 version then is a lot of fun and it looks great. It's also fairly easy to obtain, but it does require that you have some sort of device capable of playing PS2 games. You could even use something like PCSX2 on the PC to enjoy the game at higher resolutions if that option suits you. The 32X and Mega Drive versions then aren't expensive either, but require that you have a retro setup of some sort to take advantage of them. There are better ways to play, and honestly, even if you emulate them, it's not the best way to enjoy Virtua Racing today. And the Sega Saturn version, well, let's just pretend it doesn't exist. Plus, good luck getting a hold of that mobile phone version. So yeah, it's all about the Switch version for me. And really, that's Virtua Racing in a nutshell. It's one of the earliest examples of a 3D polygonal racing game, but due to Sega AM2's remarkable game design chops, it still holds up brilliantly, and even the retro aesthetic remains rather appealing today. If you miss great arcade racing games and have a Switch, this is a must-buy. M2 is making magic here, and Virtua Racing is yet another notch on its belt of quality. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this episode of DF Retro, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing that notification bell, and following us over on Twitter. Your support helps keep DF Retro alive and is always appreciated. But until next time, stay retro.